What we're going to do today during the legislative session is we're going to do a brief overcap of kind of what occurred. We'll do a deeper dive into some specific bills, and then we'll finish with some things everybody should know as we go forward for the rest of the year. A few housekeeping issues. The first is we're going to do things a little bit differently this year due to some scheduling issues. For those of you who've joined us in the past, you know that we usually reserve questions until the very end of the program. There is a scheduling issue we have to accommodate for. So when we do the update on housing and land use, we will take questions immediately after that presentation, pivot to the rest of our presentation, and then do question and answers on anything not housing or land use related at the end. So please keep that in mind if you were joining with a specific housing or land use issue. Those question period will come up much sooner. If you haven't, please make sure that you're muted. We will end today promptly at 1 o'clock to be respectful of your time and what you have to do today. We're going to touch on a lot today. Specifically, we'll start with housing and land use. We'll focus on the governor's housing production package, which is Senate Bill 1537, the housing budget bill, which is Senate Bill 1530, and UGB referrals, which is House Bill 4026-1. We will then pivot into economic and development taxation laws, specifically industrial lands legislation. That is Senate Bill 1526 and House Bill 4042. Property tax, which is HJR 201. We'll then move on to franchise fee authority, which was legislative concept number 186. We'll discuss several technology bills that could impact you, specifically right to repair, which is Senate Bill 1596, broadband efficiency, House Bill 4040, and artificial intelligence task force, House Bill 4153. We'll talk about Measure 110 reforms, which was in House Bill 4002, recreational immunity being restored in Senate Bill 1576, and we will finish the substantive discussions with stuff related to transportation, specifically the FODAR radar fix bill, which is House Bill 4109, and county right-of-way permits and fees, which is Senate Bill 1566. If time permits, we may also have an update on the governor's announcement earlier this week about her decisions related to tolling. So we're going to start first with a general overview of the session. So Jim McCauley is our legislative director. And before we get into kind of specific pieces of legislation, Jim, that either passed or died this session, what's your overall take on how the session went for Oregon cities this year? Was it successful?
Thank you, Patty. And yeah, I'm smiling, so that's a good sign. So I think we actually ended up with a pretty solid performance this session across the board. I think we were maybe a little bit surprised going into the session how we're going to determine our success. But I think we did actually very well. And I think generally the session itself managed to end effectively on a fairly upbeat note. There were certainly several bipartisan agreements during the course of the session on some major issues related to housing, addiction treatment, sentencing reform, as well as a somewhat surprising last-minute agreement on campaign finance reform as well. It's not something we've seen because consider the last two sessions were really dominated by some Republican-led walkouts, including during the 23 session when we had 6 weeks that we were out due to some controversy over some legislation. So there had to have been some post-session work with between the two parties trying to come up with a more reasoned approach to work through policy decisions. And I think that's exactly what's reflected this session. And I think by the numbers for everybody, we had 291 bills introduced. That's 180 out of the House, 111 from the Senate. About 46% of those passed. And 61 of them were truly bipartisan, where there were a number of individuals from both caucuses that supported these bills. I think the bottom line for cities at the close here is, we may sound like a broken record from week to week when we do these calls, but grassroots works. And I think the involvement that we have had from our members this session continues to certainly have a significant outcome and helps us leverage our work going into the Capitol and being able to advocate on your behalf. And we're not able to do it without that involvement. And there's no question that it's beyond just being noticed. It's having a significant influence on the work that we're doing day to day in the building. And I think that's a really important message for us going forward to take a look at as we approach the 25 session and all the work in the interim.
Thanks, Jim. And we'll get more into the specifics, but I would agree with your assessment. I too am smiling after this session. I think it was perhaps one of the most productive we've had for cities in Oregon in a long time. So we're going to start with one of our preeminent and favorite topics, which is housing and land use. Many of you will be familiar with Ariel Nelson. She is our housing and land use lobbyist. She was super busy this session. In fact, she's been super busy most sessions for the last few years, given the number of bills on this topic. But Ariel, specifically today, can you give us an update on where things stand with the governor's housing production package, the housing budget bill, and some legislation that will impact UGB referrals?
Thanks, Patty, and hi, everyone. So yeah, the first bill I'm going to focus on today is Senate Bill 1537. I think you're all fairly familiar with this bill at this point. This is the governor's housing production package. This was also a large part of this bill was a repeat from last year, from the bill the governor introduced last year. We did a lot of work on that bill last session over the interim that resulted in the LOC having a neutral position on this bill, despite some remaining concerns with several pieces of the bill. Namely, the bill establishes a new housing accountability and production office that will take in complaints or concerns regarding local implementation of housing laws. The office also comes with $5 million for local technical assistance grants and is intended to be a resource for both cities and developers. A lot remains to be seen in the implementation of that office. And so that's something that the LOC will be continuing to be engaged on and hoping to inform, again, the implementation of that office. The other major piece of the bill for cities to be aware of is that it requires cities to grant up to 10 administrative adjustments to your local siting and design standards for housing developments. The bill also establishes and funds a new state revolving loan fund with $75 million for local governments to administer loans to support moderate income housing development. That's going to take probably several months to be implemented. Oregon Housing and Community Services is the state agency implementing that. And again, hoping to inform that implementation process so that we have an exciting new resource for cities to access. The bill also allocates $3 million to Business Oregon that's intended to help small and rural local governments access infrastructure programs and grants. And then probably the most heavily covered part of the bill, at least in the media, and most controversial potentially, was the bill provides a one-time urban growth boundary expansion tool. So those are the major portions of the governor's bill. We will have a full digest of that, full unpacking in our legislative report that will come out in a couple of weeks. You ready for me to move on to the next bill, Patty?
Yeah, Ariel, just go ahead and do everything all at once.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next bill is Senate Bill 1530. This was known as the housing budget bill for the session. A number of funding efforts for a variety of affordable housing programs and infrastructure investments were included in this bill. Most important for cities, there was $65 million included in the bill to keep existing shelters open this biennium. That was really important for a number of communities. And then the bill includes $100 million in direct grants to cities for site-specific infrastructure investments to support needed housing. And this was a direct result of a survey that the LOC put out briefly this last winter. We had over 90 cities respond, and the legislature could not fund all of them. It was not, the most ideal process, but it's always a difficult one at the legislative level. And I think it was a really important first investment that we think is going to be momentum that we hope to see continued next session for continued investments. And the legislative champions around this effort, including Representative Gomberg, Representative Helm, Representative McIntyre, this was a bipartisan effort. We're really clear that they're just getting started. So we were really encouraged to see the investments in the bill this session, and again, hope to continue that momentum next session. And then finally, a bill that really took form at the very end of session that I think some of you were tracking and interested in, House Bill 4026. Was amended. It was a what's known as a placeholder bill at the end of session, and it was given a gut and stuff amendment to replace it with a program that, or a provision that's going to help out some cities and provide some certainty in that urban growth boundary expansion process. The bill simply states that local urban growth boundary expansions through the regular process are not subject, they're not eligible for referral to the ballot by voter initiative. And so that just provides some clarity and certainty to the existing land use process for cities who are going through an urban growth boundary expansion process or maybe expect to in the coming years. So this was an important bill for clarifying and giving some predictability to that existing process. And so we were happy to see that pass.
Thanks, Ariel. And for those, I know some of you joined after some initial announcements. We're changing things up a little bit today due to some scheduling issues. So if you have questions for Ariel on any of the housing and land use bills she just discussed, or any other bills that might have impacted housing or land use matters this session, now is the time to ask those questions. You can drop them in the chat or you can raise their hands. I can't guarantee that Ariel will still be available when we get to the end of today's update to answer those questions. So if you have them now, please add them or raise your hand. And while I give you an opportunity to do that quick kind of follow-up, Ariel, you mentioned a lot of the stuff still unknown, and OCHS is going to be working out the details. For those people who aren't as familiar with all aspects, what is your role in that? Will you be monitoring those situations, sitting at the table? Can you kind of tell them what to expect?
Absolutely. So a lot of these important pieces for cities are, as you said, being implemented at the state agency level. That Modern Income Revolving Loan Program is at Oregon Housing and Community Services, OHCS. The Housing Accountability and Production Office, new adjustment requirements, that's all going through the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And if you were a city that received infrastructure grant funds, that's going to be coming out of the Oregon Business Oregon department. So one of the roles that your LOC lobbyists play, we don't just work for you during session. Outside of session, we are working closely with those agencies, with the governor's office, to make sure that programs are implemented in a way that that are going to be successful for cities. And so we will be in close communication with those state agencies. I imagine it will be several months before we see implementation. We're hoping to get some information out soon about what to expect on timeline for the infrastructure grants. The Housing Accountability and Production Office at DLCD, that doesn't actually go into place. It's not actually expected to be opening its doors until the 1st of next year. So I know that there is a little bit of time for that. And we also were successful in getting a written memorandum from DLCD committing to the implementation process, that they will be consulting with cities, with developers as they stand up this office to make sure that it's going to be implementable and workable for cities as well as developers.
Thank you, Ariel. I do see one question. It is from Kimberly Culbertson. I apologize, Kimberly. I don't know if you have a title or I would have used it, but the question, Ariel, is, was there any additional monies allocated for critical home repairs?
That's a great question. I want to go back and double check. I don't believe there was home repair funding. I know there was a lot of resources in 1530 related to heating and cooling resources that local governments as well as nonprofits can access to upgrade affordable housing and different types of housing to be more climate resilient, address heating and cooling. I don't know if it's specific to those repairs, but Oregon Housing and Community Services does have resources for those programs. And I know they received, a healthy amount of funding for this biennium. So just because there wasn't specific funding in this session doesn't mean those resources aren't around in the state and aren't available. So we can look into that.
Thanks, Ariel. I've got a few more from Kelly Hart. Can you give a timing of implementation of these bills? When will the mandatory adjustments become effective? The revolving loan funds might become available, et cetera.
Yeah, and I just want to add, there was part of the healthy homes with the heating and cooling does relate to repairs related to environmental and energy efficiency measures. So if the repairs are related to those things, certainly there are new resources available for that. In terms of timeline, a lot of it is still very, kind of to be determined. We are going to be working closely with our state agency partners to support the implementation. I think it's, we need to wait and hear from OHCS on the revolving loan funds, when those funds might be available. I think conservatively speaking, I think, I would expect it to be the end of the year. There's going to need to be, the agency is going to need to do some program design. We're hoping they'll be creating some templates for cities to adopt for these processes for that program. And cities are also going to have to determine whether this program is right for them, and they need to go through their local process and, go through an ordinance to stand up and adopt a program proactively on their end as well. So all of that will take a little bit of time. But as soon as we do have information on that, we will be happy to share that, and we'll be getting that out through the bulletin. And also, I would encourage you to sign up for updates from state agencies to get it directly from the source as well. And then on the implementation date, the effective date for the mandatory adjustments, I'm going to double check that in the bill right now, and I'll put that in the chat for you. I just want to make sure I give you the right date. So I'll get that in the chat in the answer.
Thanks, Ariel. Hello to Ari. I think I heard him back there with you. So I'm not seeing any other immediate questions. If you do have some, please feel free to put them in the chat. If Ariel has to leave before we get back to those questions, please know that staff on site will make sure that we get them to Ariel so she can brief everybody. We're going to actually pivot and change up the order a little bit, again, due to some technology issues. I'm going to move to Measure 110 reforms and the restoration of recreational immunity. Scott Winkles is our general government's lobbyist, which means for this particular session, he was super busy and he was making headlines, not just in Oregon, but across the country this year, particularly related to Measure 110 and what that would mean going forward. So Scott, if you are online and you want to give everybody an update first on where we stand with Measure 110, and when you finish that, if you want to pivot to recreational immunity.
Okay. Hi, Patty. Yes, as Patty said, Scott Winkles, General Government Human Resources Lobbyist, and we do have a couple of big updates for you. First, House Bill 4002. This bill was the main vehicle for the reform of Measure 110. If you all recall, back in October, the League, along with sheriffs, the chiefs, the DAs, issued 11 recommendations to reform the system. I'm happy to report that we got most of those. There's still a work in progress that you probably heard the most about during the session and in the media was the recriminalization of the possession of hard drugs. So that is now what we call an unclassified misdemeanor. There is a specific offense or sanctioning attached to it. So under this bill, that possession will be sanctioned by up to 180 days. However, that 180 days is all what we call back end. And that means that the person wouldn't be sentenced by the judge to the 180 days. It would all come in the form of sanctioning units if the person failed to comply with the deflection program, diversion, or reoffended. And so that they would get those sentences at 30 days at a time. They'd also be eligible for a 1-to-1 day credit on time served for any day they spent in in-house in inpatient treatment or another approved treatment plan. There's some other aspects of the bill that I think are going to be very important and very significant to our ability of cities to protect the public. And one is it addressed the Boyd-Hubbell decision. Boyd-Hubbell was an adverse court ruling that made it very difficult for police officers and prosecutors to pursue dealers. The numbers we just got from last year is Oregon successfully prosecuted 198 distribution of controlled substances cases last year. Before this decision, we were looking at close to 2,000 convictions for that offense, and so we expect that to have a huge impact on our ability to enforce the law. One thing we did not get as part of the 11 recommendations, and it was really down to the final hours of session, was some clarity on the siting of secure residential facilities. That's a very important thing going forward. We'll have to address that in 2025 to make sure that we're siting these facilities in compliance with the Federal Fair Housing Act. But all in all, I think speaking for the coalition that brought the recommendations forward, we feel very good about these outcomes. And it puts us into a good position for going into 25. There's a lot of work for members to do as well as counties build deflection and diversion plans, which was part of the bill. There is money available to that. mostly through the county, but it does require some city participation. So please monitor the bulletin and other communication channels for updates on that. We'll also be discussing this at the spring conference quite a bit. So that's where we are in 110. I think we're all pretty pleased with it.
Hey, Scott, before you jump to rec community real quick, with Measure 110, because I think sometimes it can get lost. Is it fair to say that kind of the revisions that passed are fairly close to almost exactly what we wanted with our public safety coalition partners?
It is fair to say that. We issued a statement to that effect. When I say we, I mean the coalition partners. When the final amendment came out, endorsed it as in line with what we had asked for. They got the things in a couple of different ways, but the spirit of it is certainly there.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And I think this might be the second or third time in your career at the LOC you've had to restore rec community, but what can you tell us about that one this year?
Well, there's going to be a fourth. The legislature did temporarily restore recreational immunity. Sorry, I apologize for any background noise. I'm still traveling. What the legislature did is it added running, biking, and walking to the activities that are covered under recreational immunity when a person is on a landowner's property free of charge for the purpose of recreation. The bill also expanded the ability of some cities or other local governments to use a statute cities and counties have had that provides some limited liability protection on right-of-way trails. We're really focusing on adding those activities back as the benefit. However, what the legislature did is they put a sunset on it because the issue percolated very late in the legislative cycle. So there hadn't been any consideration in the 23 session. We hadn't seen, and there weren't any hearings on it in the interim. So the legislature was addressing it cold. And so when their legislature is in a position of having to act quickly, it's very common that they might put a sunset on it. So the protections are there. However, they expire in 25 after the long session. And there will be a work group that's already starting to convene and coalesce to come up with a more durable fix to this problem. And so it is what we asked for. I mean, the sunset is reasonable given the circumstances and standard legislative practice, but we will be having this conversation in 25 to be certain.
Scott, would you or somebody from the league be on that work group?
I will be on the work group, and we will be looking for only supported by some legal counsel, most likely from CIS or some member cities as well. The other stakeholders involved in this process will be districts, counties, schools, and the rec users who are really instrumental in getting this thing over the finish line this session as well. One thing that members can do that will help this process is when the governor signs the bill, and she hadn't as of a couple of hours ago, and if your city has closed a trail or restricted access, is as soon as we get word that there's ink on that bill, that we get those signs down, we get them, we get the closures announcements that the trails are reopened. It should be public, social media, pitch it to your local papers, the whole bit, lay it on thick, actually. So we want to really make the connection going into the work group that how important this is.
Thanks, Scott. And I know you briefly mentioned that you're traveling. Scott was in Washington, D.C. helping the league lobby on some federal priorities this week. He's still there. And because of that, he's having some tech issues. Is there anybody that has immediate questions for Scott related either to Measure 110 reforms or the restoration of recreational immunity? I know he's on the line now with Solid Tech. I don't know that will be true in 30 minutes. So if anybody has any immediate questions, we can take them now. You can raise your Zoom hand or put a question in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody immediately jump up, Scott, but if we get them, I will try and pivot back to you at the end. Okay. So moving on from Measure 110 in rec community, we want to talk about some economic development legislation and taxes that happen. So Lindsay Tennis, who just popped up on your screen for those of you who are watching and not just listening, she's our tax and finance lobbyist, and she works on some economic development matters as well. And while her portfolio may not have been front page news like Scott was most of the session, that doesn't mean she wasn't just as busy. And she was actually working just as hard to secure some meaningful benefits and to prohibit some bad legislation that would have impacted our members. So specifically this time, Lindsay, can you give us a member on what happened, give members an update on what happened with industrial lands and property taxes this session?
Yeah, thank you, Patty. So going into session, we had two different bills that we were trying to tackle a few pieces related to industrial land development. One piece we needed to get was the extension of the program. It expired last year, and this was also a sort of leftover piece of the semiconductor task force recommendations that we had been a part of that coalition related to, enterprise zones, the strategic investment program, and industrial lands. So we sought the sunset extension. We originally asked for a 10-year extension. We got a 6-year extension in Senate Bill 1526, which is the big revenue omnibus bill. And, at the end of the day, we were fine with that. They wanted to align it with other property tax exemption and tax credit 6-year cycles. This one is a little bit different because it's not explicitly a tax credit. It's a reimbursement method for the cities that enter into an agreement with Business Oregon. But we were successful in getting the sunset extension in Senate Bill 1526, along with some technical changes to make the program run better. And then the other piece related to industrial lands that we were seeking was a $40 million ask to capitalize industrial site loan fund. So this would actually help cities with the upfront cost of loan development. We were not successful in getting the money to start the loan fund this session, but I think we, set up a good conversation for 2025. And, really we're just asking the legislature not to forget the economic development side of infrastructure that cities need. I think the need for infrastructure related to housing development has been made loud and clear, and I think the awareness of that problem in the legislature is so much bigger now than it has been in the last couple of years, in large part due to Ariel's work. And so, we just want to make sure that they understand the element related to economic development, and that, often that's where cities get the revenue that they need to pay for services for all these new residents. So we will be coming back next year to ask for that money to capitalize the loan fund again.
And then Lindsay, you want to give us an update on some work you did behind the scenes regarding property tax measures that had been proposed?
Yeah, thank you. So one property tax measure I'll talk about in particular, HJR 201. So this measure would have referred a constitutional amendment to the voters to implement a new statewide property tax to fund public safety. And the bill said public safety, but the common understanding is that this was one of the mechanisms intended to fill the statewide funding gap for wildfire funding. And there's the state fire funding, and then there's the rural fire protection districts. And so, even though it was a new tax to fund public safety, there was no guarantee that if it passed, it actually would benefit cities at all. In fact, it probably wouldn't, because it would go first to fire districts. And then there was a split where some would go to the state directly. And so we were opposed on the grounds that property tax is local, and it should not be used for state programming. That bill did not move forward, so that was a win for us. And then I think, it's just something that we're gonna have to be vigilant on in the future to make sure that, as there are state programs that don't have stable funding mechanisms, that they don't look to property tax to fund those.
Thanks, Lindsay. Good work on keeping that one out of the legislature. We're going to pivot now to franchise fees authorities. The league knows that outside of property tax, many of you rely pretty heavily on your ability to stabilize funding resources through franchise fees. And I'd like to introduce you to those who haven't seen him yet. Michael Martin is our LOC lobbyist who handles water, wastewater, solid waste, and natural resource issues. And Ariel alluded to this a little bit, I think, in her testimony, is that lobbyists don't just work during session. We do a lot of work before and after session. And Michael, if you don't mind, if you could give the membership an update on some of the work you were able to do before session to prevent some bad legislation that could have impacted their ability to impose some franchise fees, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Patty. Before session, the Senate Energy and Environment Committee had an informational hearing about a legislative concept that would really supersede local control when it comes to franchise fees. And we reached out to Senator Solomon, who is the chair of this committee, and shared our concerns. I think, chief among them was really not being included in early conversations. We have a way that we go about things, when we're talking about complex issues, particularly in a short legislative session, there's not a lot of room to talk about that. And so we were successful at putting off this conversation until long session. So this is a concept that is going to come back. I believe Jim wrote an article that's in the bulletin and it has a link to it. This legislative concept 186 that would mess up franchise collection issues at the local level and supersede local control. So that's the highlight.
And I'm assuming, Michael, we'll be closely watching this during the next session to make sure we don't lose our abilities here. Is that fair?
That's correct. Yeah.
Good work, pre-session. Thank you. We're going to pivot now away from franchise fees and talk about technology matters. So Nolan Plesha, he's our lobbyist who handles broadband, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, energy, and environment. In this session, Nolan spent a lot of time working on things that could impact cities more from a technological perspective than perhaps say from funding or regulatory stuff like several of his colleagues. Nolan, can you give the members an update on what happened with the right to repair bill, how we were able to improve some broadband efficiency stuff, and an artificial intelligence task force?
Yes, thanks, Patty. So starting with Senate Bill 1596, also known as Right to Repair, this bill ensures a fair access to repair resources from original equipment manufacturers. Think Apple and Google as some examples. This will empower both authorized and independent repair providers to fix digital devices by accessing repair resources. Most importantly for cities, this will drive down costs for repair and purchasing of refurbished devices. It will help foster competition and create entrepreneurship opportunities throughout Oregon communities. Right to Repair has actually been a critical digital equity concept that the LOC has pursued for many years. And the passage of Senate Bill 1596 will help deliver accessible repair solution to Oregon communities' electronic needs and will create new opportunities for local businesses in your communities. The second bill I wanted to highlight today is House Bill 4040. Which was not the sexiest bill this session, but it is critical to streamlining the broadband grant application process by replacing the current grant application review committee known as GARC with the Oregon Broadband Advisory Council, also known as OBAC. OBAC is actually an existing public body and will help to enhance the transparency and efficiency in the process, thus accelerating the awards for infrastructure projects. OBAC will be tasked with reviewing and making recommendations for grant awards to the Oregon Business Development Department, and with short timelines to spend federal broadband funding, every opportunity to speed up the grant process ensures Oregon will be able to spend federal funding in the allotted time that is allowed. And this will generate high-speed broadband investments to our unserved and underserved communities sooner, bringing us closer to closing the digital divide. Additionally, cities do have a specified seat on the council, and the current chair of the council is also our mayor, Tim Rosner. And this will ensure that local governments continue to have a voice as part of the grant process. The last bill I wanted to highlight today is House Bill 4153, which establishes a legislative task force on artificial intelligence. The aim of the task force is to establish shared language and standards for potential policies and regulations across all levels of government in Oregon. We were able to secure a local government representative position on the task force, ensuring local government expertise and experience with AI are going to be reflected in the recommendations from the task force. And this will guarantee Oregon communities will be at the forefront of responsible and ethical AI implementation.
Thanks, Nolan. So like you said, it may not be sexy, but it certainly matters to all of our members on all those fronts. So thanks for all the work you did this session. We're going to finish our specific updates today back with our legislative director, Jim McCauley. In addition to leading our overall legislative priorities and kind of managing our strategies, Jim also has the benefit of being in charge of transportation as a portfolio. I don't know. And how many times he's worked on speed photo radar, which is one of the bills, Jim, if you can give us an update on kind of where things stand with photo radar, as well as some legislation about county right-of-ways and fees that local governments may need to pay.
Yeah, thank you. So 2 key issues for transportation related items this session. One was making sure that the photo radar bill that we thought was going to fix everything in 23 actually did. So the quick background here is over the summer of 23, we learned from Legislative Council and also staff within the Transportation Policy Committee or Transportation Committee in the legislature that there wasn't sufficient clarity for use of fixed photo radar, which is, I think, really the key piece here for a lot of cities. You could still establish a fixed photo radar site, but you would have to have a uniformed officer basically staring at the pole. And that, of course, reduces the value of even doing one. So the clarity that we had taken care of tightens it up, makes it really clear that from this point forward, or I'll say roughly 90 days from the close of the session, which gets you to roughly the second week of May, cities will be able to establish a fixed photo radar site. You won't have to have a uniformed officer watching it. And every city in the state will be able to do that, because before the work that we had done for the last 2 years, the city of Portland was the only city in the state that had access to that very important public safety tool that they have proven dramatically reduces the risk for vehicle crashes, for vehicle pedestrian, bicycles, and virtually everything else within those neighborhoods or those communities where those fixed photo radar sites are in place. So that's a good thing for us to have that going forward. The second element for us that we worked on quite a bit has really been a legacy issue for counties, going back to my days working for Washington County. And the idea here is that in the county right of way, there isn't the ability to have a fee structure to recover effectively the cost of having that road surface cut into for utilities. So we worked with AOC. We've been working with them on this for the last several years. This was the first time they were able to get the bill through to establish a permit structure and also a fee structure for new construction in that county right away. So we had concerns on the front end of the session and had tried to get 2 pieces, I'll say 2 elements of language added into the mix to make it clear that the counties were not going to charge for maintenance. So the way the bill is structured right now is if you have a water facility in the county right away, it's very clear that there is not going to be any charge for any maintenance activity. But if you've got stormwater or wastewater facilities, which do exist, probably more so than a water facility in those county right of ways, we were hoping to establish in language that there would not be a permit structure or a fee structure associated with general maintenance. Now, we couldn't convince enough of the committee to go forward with that type of language change, and AOC was unwilling to bend with their language. So going forward, the best I can offer you at this point is you're going to need to track those ordinances that counties put together. You're going to need to make sure that what they're putting together in those ordinances truly do stick to new construction and don't include maintenance activity, because that is clearly not the intent. I think the committee conversations that we'd had in public made that very clear, that that is not the intent of this piece of language. So it's just something I think to be aware of that we're going to have to monitor very closely, because if we find out that there are counties out there that are trying to establish a permit fee structure for general maintenance of wastewater or stormwater facilities, then we're going to be back in the session in 25 to fix it.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. We do have a little bit of time. I did see a question pop up and I see it. I'll get to it. But Jim, the governor made an announcement today that I think may have surprised some people regarding tolling. Do you want to give a brief update of what that decision was? And if you could look into your crystal ball and see what that may mean.
Yeah, sure. No, it's good. It's topical. So last year, folks may recall that the governor put a pause on the tolling conversation until 2026. On the 11th or earlier this week, the governor effectively has taken tolling off the table for projects, with the exception of the interstate bridge replacement project. So that's I-5, right? This is certainly going to have an impact on our post-session conversation on a new transportation package for 2025, because there was still some belief that we could create a transportation package that was going to have a combination of different revenue generating sources other than just gas tax or license fees or basically the current system that we use at this point in time. So we don't know exactly what type of an impact this is going to have, but I can guarantee you that if we don't have tolling as an option for I-205 and Abernathy Bridge, which were pretty well spelled out in the last transportation package, that revenue need is going to have to be picked up from another source. So that's going to be part of our conversation going into 2025. And again, I think the expectation going into that session is that somehow we were going to be able to come up with a solution for tolling concerns and things of that nature. But as the governor stated earlier this week, it's off the table. So it's going to present some additional challenges. And it's going to be reflected in whatever type of transportation package we come into the 25 session.
Thanks, Jim. So that kind of concludes what I would call our general presentation. We're going to open it up for questions now from anybody. You can do that by either raising your Zoom hand or putting it in the chat feature. 2 quick reminders for everybody. This is an opportunity for questions, not comments. While we do always want to hear from our member feedback, we also want to be mindful of the purpose and intent of this call. So please keep it to questions, and also please try and limit it to no more than 1 question at a time in case there are multiple people. That way we can get through as many people as possible. Jim, I think the first question that I see is from you. It's from the city administrator of Veneta. The question is, for county fee structure, was municipal fiber infrastructure and county right-of-way addressed?
So not specifically municipal fiber infrastructure. I will say in general, fiber infrastructure, whether it's private or public, if it's new construction, is going to be part of a permit fee going forward. They're capped at $500. The intent here is for cost recovery, so it's not supposed to be I'll just say a positive revenue generator for the county. It's specifically for cost recovery.
Thanks, Jim. And while others might be typing in questions or raising their hand, will there be a full detailed bill summary post-session that members will have access to?
Yeah, we're going to be able to get that out hopefully by the end of next week is what we're targeting right now. We're fortunate that we're not going to have to spend a full month on this like we normally do at the end of a full session, because the number of bills and stuff is a little bit certainly much smaller. But yeah, we'll get it done by the end of the month.
Excellent. And for those who may not know, we will release that bill summary notice via the bulletin. There's a question from Diana Moffett. Diana, your question's for Scott, and I have a text that says he has lost the technology screen. ability to join us. But the question is, what can you tell us about the final bill that changes the supervisory exclusions under PECBA? Diana, I will have Scott answer that question to you directly when he gets back from DC next week, and that information will be included in our bill summary. We'll make sure of it. And then the other question I had for you, Jim, in case others are still waiting to type, thanks, Diane, I saw your message, is we're approaching the, we finished 2024, we're going into 2025, and we'll be doing policy committees over the next couple months where we set our policy priorities. What do the members need to generally know? They may not be on policy committees, but what can you tell them about policy setting positions by the board happening later this year? What do they need to know before we start ramping up for 25?
Yeah, no, that's great transition because that's where a lot of our work's going to be spent over the next several months. So policy committees really start that conversation next week. My first meeting, as well as others on the IGR section, are starting up over the next couple of weeks. Our whole focus with these policy committees is to help identify, essentially by committee, what our priorities need to look like going into this next 2-year cycle. So basically, the way the time sequence is going to work is over the course of the spring and I'll say early part of June, each policy committee is going to be meeting and determining what their top priorities are. And they will advance 3 to 5 of those to basically help us construct a statewide ballot. And once that ballot is ready to go, we send that out typically kind of middle to late June. And they have the summer effectively to get back to us what their top priorities are. And then from that, we end up tallying really what those look like. And the board will get that sheet of what those top priorities are and ultimately decide on what our top priorities are going into the session. So I think the importance for members, especially those who are not on committees, every one of these policy committee meetings is publicly accessible. All you've got to do is give me a call or one of our IGR staff members or anybody else, and we can get you hooked up to the Zoom link. Everything is going to be virtual this time. There will be no in-office or face-to-face type meetings, and you have full access to listen to the conversation. And those who are on the committee have effectively voting privileges in the process. So this is really a pretty deliberative process that we've gone through in the past, and it is a member-led policy conversation for us to select really what our priorities look like for the next couple of years.
Thanks, Jim. There's a question from Roseburg City Manager. I think I might take a stab at it. The question is, will there be a policy committee once the decision from the Supreme Court regarding the grants pass case is decided? For those who may not be familiar, which would seem odd to me, the grants pass case directly deals with how cities regulate public spaces in relation to people experiencing homelessness. It's a great question, Nikki. We don't actually, most lawyers aren't expecting a decision until late this year. So either late fall or early winter before that decision happens. We will have to adjust on the fly to see if that goes to a policy committee or if it goes to our legislative committee, which is the only committee that meets during session. Because what will happen is even if the court would overturn the Ninth Circuit's decision, there's still an underlying state statute that will have to be addressed. So we're going to kind of play that one by ear, but it may be up to our legislative committee instead of the policy committees. And for those who don't know, the legislative committee is comprised of the chairs of each of our policy committees, as well as 3 members of the LOC Board of Directors to ensure the policy committees are never out of step with the full Board of Directors and representatives from our Women's Caucus and People of Color Caucus. We do still have some time for questions. I've got one more for you, Jim. I think you and multiple other members of your team today mentioned how successful it was to have members kind of take some grassroots advocacy. Session's over. It's not going to start again for another 8 months. Do you want the members to sit silent, or what should they be doing in the interim?
I want you to take a break, maybe for a week or two, celebrate some success, because I think everybody who had a part in this session should take some time to reflect on what worked. But this is a full-time job in terms of our advocacy, not just within the league, but your communication and your partnership development with your legislators. We have an election cycle coming up this year. There will be some significant changes because of the Supreme Court ruling in the state. 10 senators are not going to be running or able to run for re-election because they went beyond the 10-day unexcused absences during the 23 session. So because of the the election cycle, 6 of those folks will be not running for re-election this cycle. And in 26, 4 more will not be running for re-election cycle. So one of the things that we really mention in a lot of our communication with members is those partnerships need to be sustained during session and after session. And you really need to take a look at who the new folks are going to be, because we're going to be talking about brand new people that may not have a local government background, and they're going to need education throughout the process. The other part of this, I think, conversation for folks is to make sure that I'll use the housing process that we had this last time, specifically the projects, the infrastructure projects. So we had a window of roughly 10 days right around Thanksgiving to essentially try to get a list of shovel-ready infrastructure projects. We had 93 cities respond to that with over 220 projects, because there were some cities that were submitting multiple projects. For those of you that did not get that funding in the pieces of, or the budget bills that came out or finished up this session, you have an opportunity this summer and in the fall to start taking some of your state elected officials out and letting them see these projects firsthand, because I think that's a great way to help demonstrate what that need is. It's going to help us going into the 25 session for infrastructure needs and being able to have some data behind it. The other thing that you can do is we've got an inventory survey that's out there right now that's going to be incredibly critical for us for that 25 session, just like it was when we had something specific just for housing related infrastructure. So that needs to be filled up, because that's got transportation in it, as an example. And I'm going to need to have something behind me to be able to advocate for a sizable transportation package in 25. If I don't have the data, it reduces my ability to be able to make the case for the value. The final piece here is really, we have a lobbying 101 toolkit for the first time. A lot of work went into it. There's a lot of great video that's in it. And there's also a lot of other materials in there that I think can help anybody who's a novice to being able to advocate on your community's behalf, but even those who have been doing it for years might pick up some nuances and some values as well. So yeah, this is a full-time gig with advocacy. And like I said, take a week or two to celebrate the success, but get back into it and get yourself ready to go for 25 session.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm not seeing other questions, but I do want to take a few minutes as we conclude, first and foremost, to thank all of you. You've heard it a lot from the lobbying team today, but I'd like you to hear it from me as well. Your efforts this session played a pivotal role in why we were able to have such a successful session. It was the relationships you formed with your representatives and senators, the meetings you had, the phone calls you made, and the emails you sent. All of the work we were able to accomplish is directly related to the work that you have also put into making sure that the state sees you as partners and recognizes where it can lift you up or where it can push you down. So a big hearty thank you to all of you on the call and to all of your colleagues who could not make it today. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at the Lobbying 101 Toolkit, I strongly encourage you to do so. There's a lot of information in there on what you can be doing in between sessions, on how to build those relationships, make your legislators hear you and see you as a partner instead of just another advocacy group. Also, if you haven't had a chance to do so yet, the Women's Caucus has put forward its first ever podcast, specifically featuring women in local government. We've had some really good participation in terms of people downloading and listening to the podcast, and I'd encourage you to do the same. This week, we're featuring Pendleton City Councilor and LOC board member McKenna McDonald. If you've not yet registered to attend LOC Spring Conference in Klamath Falls, April 25th and 26th, I encourage you to do so specifically before April 4th, which is, I believe, coming up here very quickly in about 2 weeks. After April 4th, the registration cost will increase. So if you're thinking about it, please make sure you register as soon as possible. And last, but certainly not least, LOC's president, Mayor Dave Drotzman of Hermiston, will be hosting a series of meetings across the state over the next 6 months. The purpose of which is to hear from you on what type of challenges you're having from a revenue perspective. Where are you experiencing gaps and shortfalls? What are you identifying as barriers to successfully funding the needs of your cities? I would encourage each of you to get on the league's website. You can find that under our events calendar and go to one of those regional meetings. If the LOC has any hope in 2025 and thereafter in securing revenue relief for cities, your direct information will be helpful to make sure we meet your needs. So as it's Friday afternoon, we're going to finish a little bit early today. I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you all for all of your hard work during the short session. And if you want to walk away with some good news, please know that this session, I think collectively the league, its board of directors and its staff all feel like we had some really substantial wins for cities. So thank you. Have a great weekend and we'll see you all soon.